George Stubbs was the greatest horse painter of his age. His animals were anatomically more accurate than any of those by his forerunners, and their behaviour, including their relationships with their handlers, more closely observed. The scale and sophisticated compositions of his paintings far exceeded the narrow scope of traditional countryside scenes. And yet Stubbs never shook off the stigma attached to sporting art. According to a ditty by Peter Pindar,
"'Tis said that naught so much the temper rubs of that ingenious artist Mr. Stubbs, as calling him a horse painter. How strange that Stubbs the title should desire to change."
For 150 years, Stubbs was largely ignored by the art establishment. But in the mid-20th century, his work began to be rediscovered and reassessed. The art world finally realised that it had seriously misjudged the ingenious Mr. Stubbs. Born in 1724 in Liverpool, Stubbs's father was a currier or leather dresser.
Stubbs always claimed that his family were well off and that his father was a considerable merchant of Liverpool, but I suspect they weren't that well off. The record doesn't seem to show it, and it's more likely to me that the father was a moderately successful merchant who passed on to his son the primary virtues of hard work and good and right living, right thinking. He resisted, therefore, the idea that Stubbs should become an artist, and he even is supposed to have flogged him when he told his father that he wanted to. But ultimately, John Stubbs did relent. On his deathbed, he said that Stubbs could become an artist.
Stubbs began training as an artist at the age of around 17.
At 17 or 18, Stubbs goes to Knowsley Hall, where he's apprenticed to a local artist, Hamlet Winstanley. Winstanley's the sort of the tame house artist to Lord Derby, who lives at Knowsley and has a magnificent collection of old master paintings, antique sculptures, a huge library, and many fine prints in his collection also. And these, for the first time, were seen by Stubbs. He'd never probably seen an old master painting. He'd probably never seen a library. So he's now exposed to Enlightenment culture for the first time. And I think without that experience, even though he doesn't get on well with Winstanley and leaves, he says, within a few weeks or perhaps days, he suggests, of going there, I feel that he was there for much longer than that in order to absorb the lessons of looking at that collection.
At first, Stubbs did not specialise in animal paintings, but in the standard bread-and-butter business of portraits, although the odd hound was already sneaking in. As well as painting portraits, Stubbs worked as an anatomist, both drawing and lecturing in human anatomy. These images are from a book on midwifery, published in 1751, when the 27-year-old Stubbs was living in York.
One of the most surprising things to me when I was working on Stubbs was the discovery that he'd been married in the 1740s when he was in his mid-20s, and that he stayed with this woman for 8 or 9 years, and that they had 4 children together, the eldest of whom was George Townley Stubbs, who later grew up to be his father's assistant and was an expert engraver. Now, one feels that he wouldn't have been called Townley unless that was his mother's maiden name, and that therefore she might have been a member of a very large Catholic family of gentry, the Townleys, from Lancashire, and that this is supported by the fact that all their friends in York, all the people we know Stubbs associated with in York, were Catholics or Jacobites or non-jurors or didn't support the Hanoverian dynasty in some way. And it's interesting that later on, this woman is completely written out of the record by Stubbs. When he's speaking to his friends, when he's speaking to his future biographer about his life, he doesn't mention her. And clearly there's some sense of shame or taint about this relationship, which he doesn't want to talk about.
At the age of 32, Stubbs took the conscious decision to become the best painter of horses that had ever been. He wouldn't learn his craft in the conventional manner by studying past masters, but by studying from nature and by using his experience as an anatomist to study the horse's physique, inside and out. It was an extremely dirty job. In 1756, Stubbs was living with Mary Evans, the woman who was to be his partner for the next 50 years. Together, they moved from York, where they had been living, to the village of Hawkstow, near Hull, where Stubbs rented a barn in which he could carry out his dissections. Each horse carcass was suspended from the ceiling and the arteries injected with liquid wax. The wax would harden, holding the shape of the arteries. The whole messy, smelly business was described by Stubbs's biographer, Ozias Humphrey.
He first began by dissecting and designing the muscles of the abdomen, proceeding through 5 different layers of muscles till he came to the peritoneum and the pleura, through which appeared the lungs and the intestines. Prepared the muscles, etc. He made careful designs of them. Then he took off another layer of muscles, which he prepared, designed, and described in the same manner. And so he proceeded till he came to the skeleton.
In 1758, Stubbs brought his project to London, but couldn't find an engraver who would take it on. His 18-month unpaid project was not considered a commercial prospect, despite the fact that all the existing anatomies were based on Carlo Ruini's outdated 1598 attempt, which was desperately inaccurate. Stubbs's only option was to engrave the works himself. It took him about 6 years, because he could only work on it in the early mornings and late evenings. His days were taken up with paid commissions. But he did it, and The Anatomy of the Horse was finally published in 1766. The engravers might have been unconvinced, but the value of Stubbs's work did not go unrecognised. Almost as soon as he reached London and began to show his pictures to potential clients, Stubbs began to receive commissions from a group of young aristocrats who were particularly proud of their horses. The horse in the 18th century was as central to people's lives as the car is today. And like the car, it could also be used as an indication of taste and income. Among the first of Stubbs's patrons was the 24-year-old Charles Lennox, Duke of Richmond, who commissioned 3 large canvases of life at his Sussex estate, Goodwood. The Duke himself appears in one of them, a tall, elegant figure on a dark bay stallion.
This is one of the 3 canvases by George Stubbs for the 3rd Duke. It shows the Charlton Hunt. The Charlton Hunt was located over the next hill, and it was in fact the reason that the 1st Duke came to live here at Goodwood. At the centre of the canvas, wearing his dark blue Charlton Hunt livery, is the 3rd Duke, and with him his brother, Lord George Lennox, and there are, of course, other friends with them. Beyond, you can see the hunt in full cry. Every hound is an individual portrait.
The value of the anatomical drawings is clear in the early Goodwood pictures. In this hunting scene, we get a real sense of the horse pushing off with its back right leg in order to lift the left. Stubbs had depicted an animal with muscles and sinews in motion, not the static models common in sporting art. Not quite as successful are the faster-moving horses. The dark grey jumping a gait on the left is slightly toy-like, and the galloping horses in the background have all 4 legs stretched out in the conventional but physically impossible pose that all horse artists seem to have chosen at the time. This is hardly Stubbs's fault. It was fiendishly difficult to work out what was happening in that blur of legs until the advent of photography. It wasn't until the 1870s when the photographer Edward Muybridge invented a technique of taking pictures in a sequence that a horse's movement could be studied in detail. Muybridge's late 19th century pictures revealed that all 4 legs are never all outstretched, and all 4 hooves only leave the ground when the horse's legs are tucked underneath it. It also reveals the problem with the jumping horse. Its back legs are much too close to that gait, an almost impossible position to get into, and one which would make it extremely difficult to get over. Stubbs seems to have been aware that the galloping horses were incorrect, and whenever possible he opted to paint them standing, trotting, or rearing rather than racing. The Goodwood paintings were quickly followed by several other commissions from equally prominent sources, and Stubbs moved from one stately home to another. So who were Stubbs's patrons, and why were they so keen to employ him? The Duke of Richmond was one of a group of educated, cultivated young aristocrats, many of whom were active in Whig politics, all of whom were fanatical about horses. The group were later to become centred around Charles Watson Wentworth, the second Marquess of Rockingham, seen here in Reynolds's portrait. The Rockinghams, as the group became known, were also discerning buyers and patrons of art. They had all done the obligatory Grand Tour, the extended trip around Europe, considered an essential feature of an aristocratic education. The young men were accompanied by a carefully chosen guide, or bear leader, to see the great works of Renaissance and classical art and architecture, and to shop for paintings and sculptures with which to decorate their stately piles and smart London houses. Rockingham, who commissioned 12 horse paintings from Stubbs, including the National Gallery's famous portrait of Whistlejacket, had an estate in Yorkshire at Wentworth Woodhouse. Stubbs's paintings of his patrons on their estates are related to a particularly 18th century genre of art known as the conversation piece. These informal portraits were conscious pieces of self-aggrandizement or celebration, the 18th century equivalent of Hello magazine. This conversation piece of the Millbank and Melbourne families, painted by Stubbs in about 1769, was probably commissioned to commemorate the marriage of Elizabeth Millbank to Penistone Lamb, 1st Lord Melbourne. In true Hello fashion, the marriage was followed by a series of scandals as Elizabeth took up with a succession of lovers. Often set in an idyllic pastoral scene, conversation pieces, like the carefully selected pictures in a photograph album, showed a family at its happiest. They also emphasised the wealth and status of their subjects, while making that status look natural, as in Gainsborough's Mr. and Mrs. Andrews, or Joseph Wright's Mr. and Mrs. Coltman. The beautiful condition of a particular individual's estate and animals showed how fitting and proper it was that he should own them. For men like Richmond and Rockingham, horses were among their most treasured assets, and they were keen to show them off. The 18th century was racing's golden age and saw the establishment of many of the classic races, such as the Derby, the Oaks and the St. Leger. The big race winners, such as Eclipse and Gimcrack, became national heroes. The century was also a period of scientific development, the Age of Enlightenment, which prided itself on its reasoned and empirical investigation of the natural world. Passionate about racing and racehorses, it employed systematic methods to create a new breed of horse, the thoroughbred. During the early 18th century, stallions were being brought over from the Middle East and matched with part Arab mares to improve British stock. Careful breeding produced horses that were bigger, faster, and matured younger, thoroughbred for racing. For a horse to be considered a pure thoroughbred today, it must be able to trace its lineage back to one of 3 exceptional Arab stallions brought over at around the turn of the century: the Baali Turk, the Dali Arabian, and the Godolphin Arabian. Races were becoming shorter and much more exciting to watch. At the beginning of the century, races were generally run over 4 miles, which usually meant a 3.5-mile lollop followed by a short sprint at the end. Many races were run in heats, so that a horse might have to run 4 races at one meeting. The shorter races were all done at a flat-out gallop. They were far more thrilling, and there were more of them. More races meant more opportunities for betting, and betting, then as now, was half the fun. Horace Walpole wrote disapprovingly that half the nobility and half the money of England went to the Newmarket racetrack. 18th century society's excessive love of the races was considered morally damaging, and it could certainly be financially damaging. Considerable family fortunes were occasionally gambled away at the track. Betting at the races was not confined to horses. According to Horace Walpole, dice caused the most mischief, cards were inevitably a factor, and cockfighting was still a perennial favourite. As today, a race meeting could attract huge crowds, although these are never even suggested in Stubbs's paintings. Other images from the period show that even the racecourse itself wasn't free from spectators. Mounted onlookers piled onto the track to accompany the winners over the finish line. Stubbs chooses to show a quiet, backstage view of the races. His pictures show serious professionals about to set off to work, or having finished a race. Several pictures show horses being rubbed down after a race outside the rubbing down house at Newmarket. The sweaty horses were dried off with cloths and handfuls of straw, used to push the hair up the wrong way to make sure they were thoroughly dried. In the early 1750s, a group of gentleman enthusiasts in the Newmarket area established what seems to have started as an informal dining club. They referred to themselves as the Jockey Club. Before long, they began to be asked to adjudicate in times of dispute. Then, as now, the money involved in racing meant that people were sensitive to possible cases of fraud. The Jockey Club was seen as impartial and incorruptible. They stuck by their decisions even when this meant accusing the Prince of Wales's own jockey of race fixing. The brilliant but insufferably arrogant jockey Sam Chifney was banned from Newmarket after losing a race one day on the Prince's horse Escape, only to beat the same competitor's Hollow the next day, having bet heavily on himself at very favourable odds. The Prince stuck by his jockey and the club by its ban. Soon their authority began to extend beyond Newmarket racetrack, and today, of course, they are the body that regulates racing all over the country. Successful racehorses were thoroughly pampered, although sometimes in ways that did more harm than good. Docking tails, which involves amputating the tailbone, was standard practice, and not only for racehorses. It was considered smarter looking and kept the tail out of the way, but left the horses with nothing to keep the flies off with. By the middle of the century, some objections were raised on the grounds of cruelty, but it was still extremely popular, as was cropping the ears to make them curve. The horses were trained hard and their weight kept carefully down. Racehorses now don't carry much in the way of spare flesh, but in the 18th century they were considerably thinner. One of the ways of making sure they kept their weight down was to sweat them, and racehorses were kept heavily rugged up even when exercising.
This is one of 3 works painted by George Stubbs for the 3rd Duke of Richmond. You can tell the horses are being exercised, not raced, because although they're all in the Duke of Richmond's racing livery, which is yellow with red, they're not actually wearing racing costume. The jockeys are in little frock coats and the horses have on them blankets and also hoods.
It also made life very difficult for painters, since owners might refuse to let them see the horse unrugged. They would have to guess at what the horse's body looked like, since only the most prestigious artists, such as Stubbs himself, could insist on having his model undress. As well as being warm, stables on the larger estates were spectacularly grand, as the stables at Wentworth Woodhouse and Goodwood illustrate. Grooms lived in the yard with their charges and worked almost as hard as the horses. The summertime working day started extremely early, as it still does, and with few days off. A groom would be assigned a particular horse to care for and ride. Gallops were interspersed with long periods of walking to let the horses recover their breath, and then they would be galloped again. They were exercised morning and evening, and an exercise period could last up to 4 hours, whereas racehorses today are only exercised once a day and for much shorter periods. Good trainers, grooms and jockeys were highly valued by their employers, and there seems to have been an informality and mutual respect between them, despite the difference in social class, that was rarely found elsewhere. When the Marquess of Rockingham was away from his estate on political business, he received regular updates from his groom, Simon Cobb, on developments at the stable, such as the birth of a foal. And when his jockey John Singleton retired, Rockingham gave him the yard favourite, Scrub, to keep him company. The relationship between handlers and horses is something that Stubbs captured like no one else. The character of the individual animals and the way they interacted with each other and with their grooms and riders is instantly readable and instantly recognisable to anyone familiar with horses. Look at the grooms rubbing down the grey horse in the Duchess of Richmond, watching Richmond's racehorses at exercise. We're watching professionals at work. They're businesslike about their task, ignoring the horse's fidgeting legs and its attempts to avoid having its face wiped. Rockingham's groom, Simon Cobb, gives the notoriously fiery-tempered Whistlejacket an affectionate hug while he stands loose with 2 other stallions. In Grey Hunter with a Groom, the groom watches indulgently as horse and dog tentatively check each other out. In Lord Torrington's Hunt Servants setting out from South Hill, Bedfordshire, the bay in the centre of the painting looks anxiously after its companion, eager to follow. The groom riding him looks apprehensively at the horse he's going to lead, who looks out at us, ears back bad-temperedly. The groom on the ground has tied a neckerchief to the dog's collar to prevent it from following the horses out to the hunt. Gimcrack's groom stands well back, a rein in each hand, suggesting he doesn't trust the animal not to try and bite him. Groups of mares and foals feed, graze and socialise, just as they do when turned out in a field together. In Stubbs's paintings, the horses look huge, of a similar size to racehorses today, which stand typically at between 15.2 and 17 hands, that is, between 1.6 and 1.7 metres from ground to shoulder. Actually, they were much smaller. This is a 14.2 horse, and this is a 16.2 thoroughbred, which means that if Stubbs was painting Whistlejacket true to life, Rockingham's groom, Simon Cobb, was only about 4'8", 1.40 m. Scrub was even smaller, at 14.1, technically a pony. Certainly the jockeys were small, as they are now. In this cartoon, there is a noticeable height difference between them and the mounted spectators behind. Owners clearly adored their horses, and not just for the races they won or the amount of money they earned. One of the most famous pictures of a horse in Western art is of a little Palomino stallion who was no great success on the racecourse. Whistlejacket may not have been a great winner, but aesthetically he was a near-perfect specimen of an Arab stallion. A grandson of the great Godolphin Arabian, Whistlejacket's arched neck, fine legs and delicate hooves, and his small head with prominent eyes are classically Arab traits. He was owned by Rockingham, and the portrait was made in 1762, when Stubbs was 38 and the horse was 13. Old in racing terms, the horse had been retired to stud. Stubbs's portrait shows him rearing up, without saddle or bridle. He could almost be wild, except that he is clearly being groomed and shod. Whistlejacket's rearing pose does closely resemble the levade, the controlled dressage move seen in so many equestrian portraits. The back hooves in line, the front ones almost together, not striking out in either aggression or play. A near life-size portrait of a horse, just a horse, was so extraordinary that it was assumed to have come about by accident. The painting must surely have been planned as an equestrian portrait, complete with rider. We even have a candidate for who the rider was to have been. Soon after the painting's completion, Horace Walpole saw it and confidently asserted that Rockingham had intended to commission an equestrian portrait of George III, but had changed his mind. Stubbs's biographer, Ozias Humphrey, reported that portrait, landscape and horse were all to be painted by the leading exponents of their art, so Stubbs, as leading horse painter, would only do this section of the painting. Even so, one might expect him to have left a little more space for the king. A rider on Whistlejacket would be rather off-centre. Grand equestrian portraits made sense. There was a tradition of them. They represented the power of rulers over their people, and in the 18th century, the age of scientific investigation, they were a symbol of measured reason over animal passion. Jonathan Swift had deliberately subverted this idea in the 1720s in Gulliver's Travels. Swift's imaginary worlds highlighted the absurdities of human society. His only reasonable creatures are the gentle Houyhnhnms, the civilized talking horses, illustrated here by Saury Gilpin. The conceit of the stallion as an emblem of passion that needed to be controlled by a reasonable man is turned on its head. The success of Whistlejacket as a work of art seems just too striking for some art historians to believe that it could have been the result of an accident. The plain background, which looks surprisingly modern to our eyes, is a Stubbsian innovation and seems to have been done at Rockingham's request. Whistlejacket stands out like a classical sculpture. Stubbs and Rockingham between them had found another way to elevate the mere copying of sporting art to a new level, one that combined Rockingham's love of individual horses with his love of both classical and modern art. The effect was so striking that he commissioned further works with the same plain background. Mares and Foals is a variation on a composition that Stubbs used in several paintings, but here, against the plain background, the effect is that of a classical frieze. It is also reminiscent of a statue, and Rockingham owned at least 3 bronze statues of horses. The device suited Stubbs's style, which depends on strong linear outlines, focusing on shapes. Even in Stubbs's pictures, which do include landscapes, the composition is made up of planes parallel to the surface of the painting. The shape of the horses, often painted in perfect profile, stand out against light backgrounds. Whatever the explanation, the result was innovative and extraordinary. The 18th century adoration of the Arab horse made it a suitable subject for serious painting in a way that couldn't have happened in British art in the preceding centuries. Added to which, there was a growing concern with animal welfare. People questioned the morality of how they were treated, and horses were the focus of concern. While attitudes to animals might have started to become more enlightened, attitudes to animal painting had not. Stubbs's talent was recognised as superior in his department, but it was still a department shunned by the highbrow art world. In fact, Stubbs had been producing works that were even further away from the traditional forms of sporting art than Whistlejacket and Mares and Foals. Among the other canvases commissioned by Rockingham was this painting of a horse and lion. There is a story, which may well be apocryphal, that while travelling in Italy, the artist met a Moroccan aristocrat and visited his father's castle at Ceuta in Morocco. During a moonlit walk along the castle walls one evening, he saw a lion stalking and then killing a wild horse. It seems unlikely that Stubbs saw a real lion attacking a real horse, but the beauty of the terrified horse and the savagery of the lion were subjects that he returned to repeatedly for over 25 years. As an artist who prided himself on drawing accurately from life, it would be typical of Stubbs to claim that his inspiration for the picture came from the observation of nature. But there were certain classical works, notably this statue from the Capitoline Museum in Rome, that Stubbs cannot fail to have seen on his travels in Italy. Actually, it may have looked rather different when Stubbs saw it, as the horse's head and neck were originally twisted round toward the lion. Where possible, Stubbs did work from life, and he made a number of sketches of a lion belonging to Lord Shelburne, which was kept in a cage at Shelburne's villa in Hounslow Heath. While Lord Shelburne's lion was a useful model for the lion pacing or at rest, the similarity between the Capitoline statue and Stubbs's attacking lion is striking. This series of paintings was also influenced by certain ideas about aesthetics that were current at the time. They correspond to an interest in the sublime, a term that had recently been discussed by the statesman and writer Edmund Burke.
The passion called up by the great and the sublime in nature is astonishment. And astonishment is that state of the soul in which all its motions are suspended with some degree of horror. In this case, the mind is so entirely filled with its object that it cannot entertain any other. nor, by consequence, reason on that object which employs it.
Stubbs's horse, in its state of frozen terror, is an embodiment of Burke's idea of the sublime. The landscapes in the sublime pictures are wild, with looming cliffs and threatening clouds. Stubbs frequently used an area called Cresswell Crags in Yorkshire as his basis. The same background appears in other works. But in the sublime pictures, he adds exotic touches, such as the palm tree. The style of painting in the sublime pictures is very different from the portraits of real horses. If we compare Gimcrack, or even the half-wild Whistlejacket, with the beasts in A Horse and Lion, we are clearly dealing with a more fluid and painterly technique. Stubbs's horses in these works are not as naturalistic as they are in his sporting art, but they are deliberately stylized. The expressions of fear in the horses' faces are almost human. Another subject that Stubbs worked and reworked was the image of Phaeton driving the chariot of the sun. The mythical Phaeton was the son of Apollo, the sun god, who begged his father to allow him to drive his chariot across the sky, but couldn't control its fiery steeds. In order to prevent the destruction of the universe, Jupiter struck Phaeton with a thunderbolt, and he plummeted, burning, to his death. In choosing a mythical subject, Stubbs was deliberately associating himself with the most distinguished form of artistic endeavour, history painting. As well as experimenting with subject matter, Stubbs was also a keen experimenter with materials. His friendship with ceramics magnate Josiah Wedgwood came about because Stubbs was interested in painting using enamel colours on hard surfaces, such as copper or ceramic. This innovation was something of which he was evidently proud, as in his portrait he has himself depicted holding a version of Phaeton painted onto copper. Unfortunately for Stubbs, these experiments didn't take off in the way that he'd hoped, and he was forced to continue looking for the sort of commissions he had received from the Rockinghams. Despite Stubbs's popularity among discerning patrons, his importance as an artist was never really acknowledged by the art establishment. Throughout most of his career, Stubbs had deliberately shunned the elitist Royal Academy, considered the arbiter of taste, acceptance to which was judged essential for any serious artist. Instead, Stubbs was involved with the less prestigious but older professional group, the Society of Artists. When this folded, he was forced to turn to the Academy, who offered him membership on condition that he submit the customary signature work demanded of younger painters. Outraged, Stubbs refused and remained an associate, but not a full member of the Academy. Even more humiliating, Stubbs, once the darling of the Whig aristocracy, was falling out of fashion. The experiments with enamels had been a drain on resources. Now in his 60s, the artist found himself having to struggle to find commissions. However, in 1790 he secured an order for 14 paintings from a particularly distinguished patron, the Prince of Wales. Prince George, George IV to be, was a playboy and dilettante. By the age of 17, he already admitted to being rather too fond of women and wine. In 1790, he was 28 and a world-class libertine, overindulging in every pleasure he could lay his chubby fingers on. To his father, George III's disgust, he had surrounded himself with a crowd of extravagant, alcoholic, and thoroughly unsuitable hangers-on, and was running up debts at a staggering rate. One particularly effective way of disposing of his considerable income was to buy art, and he did at least have an eye for good art. The Prince commissioned a series of paintings for Carlton House, his London home, involving outdoor pursuits. Only one shows the Prince himself, riding a smart chestnut. Stubbs had slimmed him down considerably. The cartoonists show the Prince in a very different shape. All in all, his lifestyle was the opposite to that of the abstemious Stubbs.
All the evidence is that Stubbs was a teetotaler who walked a lot. Right up into his old age, he was apparently capable of walking 12 or 13 miles from London to Watford with all his painting gear, and that he led a quiet life. He did socialise with other artists, but he doesn't seem to have been in any way like the sort of hell-raising artist that you sometimes might associate with the Regency period, the period in which he died.
Another of the Carlton House series shows the fascinating Lady Lade. Letitia Lade had started out as a servant in a brothel in St Giles in London and ended up married to the Prince's racing manager, Sir John Lade. In the interim, she was rumoured to have been the mistress of a notorious dandy highwayman, 16-string Jack, who was hanged in 1774. She was famous for riding and cursing like a jockey, much to the Prince's amusement, who coined the phrase to swear like Lady Lade. Stubbs shows her asking her horse for a levade, a rear on command, which she does with admirable composure. She rides side saddle and with the horse in a double bridle, standard for dressage and often used for hunting or hacking out. The top set of reins are attached to a soft bit, the bottom set to a stronger one, so that the rider can give light or firm commands as necessary. This horse also has side reins, straps attaching the bridle to the saddle, which encourage the horse to arch its neck and tuck its head in. The horse's ears, both swivelled round to the rider, show that she has his undivided attention, a different signal from the flat back ears denoting anger, as with the grumpy gimcrack. One of the most spectacular of Stubbs's late commissions was this monumental picture of the star racehorse Hambletonian, made in 1799, when Stubbs was 75. Almost life-sized, it shows the tetchy racehorse outside the familiar rubbing down house at Newmarket. Hambletonian belonged to the splendidly named Sir Henry Vane Tempest, and the painting was commissioned to celebrate an enormously lucrative match race between Tempest's horse and a horse called Diamond. When the painting was finished, Tempest decided he didn't want it after all, and Stubbs had to take him to court to get his fee. Why Vane Tempest tried to avoid buying the painting is a mystery. It shows Stubbs at his best, producing the kind of works for which he is now most respected, his exceptionally accurate depictions of professional racehorses and the people who worked with them.
It appears that Stubbs had had no illnesses, that he was healthy and still able to walk long distances right up to the day before he died. And it's recorded by Mary Spencer, the woman that he lived with for 40 years, that on that last day before he died, he had a very long walk. He'd come back, he'd visited several friends, he'd come home, gone to bed, and woken up in the early hours with a terrible pain. And he'd immediately decided that this was going to be his last day. For example, he changes his will and he cuts out both his son, George Townley Stubbs, and his son by Mary Spencer, whose name was Richard.
Stubbs sat down to breakfast with friends for a time before taking himself upstairs to his room, where he died. He was 82.
The decline in Stubbs's reputation, which had started before his death, continued afterwards, and it's interesting that the family made no serious attempt to reverse that, to create a kind of Stubbs heritage. And it wasn't until the 1950s that there was a scholarly appreciation or a reassessment of Stubbs, and there was also the beginning of awakening of his name in the public, so that we've now got a situation where Whistle Jacket is one of the most popular paintings in the National Gallery. His postcard is one of the best-selling postcards. Stubbs is somehow or other a national treasure.